Welcome to WashingtonTok. I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has been making high-profile visits, vowing to overcome U.S.-led sanctions and urging his people to pursue self-reliance. Is this a sign of desperation?
보기만 해도 기분이 나빠지는 너저런 남측 시설들을 남측의 관계 부문과 합의해서 싹 드러내도록 하고, 자기 힘을 믿고 하나로 굳게 뭉쳐 일도 설 때 못해낼 일이 없다는 우리식 다륙갱생의 생활력이 또 한 번 뚜렷이 확증된
In the studio with me today, Mr. Eric Brewer, fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. At the National Security Council, Mr. Brewer played a lead role coordinating the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy on North Korea. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Brewer, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has been emphasizing self-reliance and overcoming of U.S. sanctions ever since the breakdown of the Stockholm talks. And is this a sign of desperation?
I don't think so. I think if Kim Jong-un was desperate for sanctions relief, I think we would have seen Stockholm go a lot differently, at least some sort of continuation of the dialogue. I think right now Kim sees himself as having the upper hand in diplomacy and in dialogue. I don't think, of course, does he want sanctions relief? Of course he does. But I don't think he feels the need to adjust his negotiating position right now in order to acquire that. I think he's confident, and I think right now his strategy is to slowly dial up the temperature and the heat on the United States and South Korea to see if he can soften their negotiating positions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would agree with what Eric has had to say. What we've seen, I think, since Hanoi is an emphasis in North Korea since April on retrenchment and on an attempt to try to do things by themselves. Kim Jong-un has been emphasizing national self-respect and really encouraging internal efforts to try to achieve economic objectives.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Brewer, you coordinated the maximum pressure policy at the White House. So how do you see it? The current U.S. and UN sanctions on North Korea, has it dealt a severe blow on the economy?
So I think the sanctions that were put in place, that have been put in place over time, both through the UN Security Council and also by the United States and its allies and partners, particularly those that started to target North Korea's sectoral trade towards those sort of began at the end of the Obama administration and continued in 2017 during the Trump administration. I think those have had a real serious negative impact on North Korea's economy, particularly its ability to generate revenue. However, sanctions are not self-enforcing. They are not self-sustaining. They require constant update and refinement and addition. And so I think as the United States is sort of, particularly at the top, at President Trump's level, as they've taken their foot off the gas of the maximum pressure campaign, I think that momentum is significantly less than it was before. And so I think that has, it's made it harder for the United States to go out and make the case to other countries that sanctions enforcement is important.
Mm-hmm. And amid Chairman Kim's calls for self-reliance and overcoming of sanctions, North Korea's Kim Gae-gan issued a statement emphasizing the close relationship between President Trump and Chairman Kim and that will help overcome the obstacles. So does North Korea, is it saying that it wants another round of summit soon?
I think this was the most explicit statement of support for a leader-to-leader level dialogue that would bypass the working level dialogue. It could mean that the North Koreans were not very impressed with what they saw from Stockholm, or it could simply imply that they believe that they can get a better deal if they can just get Trump in the room by himself with Kim Jong-un.
And also, North Korea, Chairman Kim at Mount Kumgang ordered to remove all South Korean facilities. And up until recently, North Korea actually has been asking South Korea to reject foreign influence and go ahead with opening of the Kaesong Industrial Complex and the renewal of the tours to Mount Kumgang. So why do you think the opposite messaging at this time to South Korea?
Well, I think that the message from Kim Jong-un to Moon is that the window is closing to be able to pursue a unified Korean economic project, which is one of Moon's big campaign objectives. And so I think that what we see is, pressure, moving from expropriation of South Korean assets, which we've seen in the past, to actual destruction and possible rebuilding of those assets. And so essentially I think that Kim Jong-un is saying, well, we're turning the page on the prospect for an inter-Korean project. We'd like to do it ourselves.
I agree with Scott, and I think part of the goal is to put pressure on the Moon administration. We've seen in press reports since a response from the Moon administration talking about perhaps coming up with some way to work this out. So to that, in that sense, there's been some success. I also think, to Scott's point, North Korea knows that this project and others are priority for the Moon administration. And so I think there's some thinking if they think they can convince South Korea that these are no longer on the table, then that could also lead South Korea to put pressure on the United States to allow some sort of resumption of cooperation.
And in response to Chairman Kim's comments, President Moon said that tours to Mount Kumgang are not in violation of UN Security Council resolutions in itself, but paying for those tours are. And Seoul's Unification Ministry says that it will seek creative solutions to this issue. So if South Korea does not pay in cash and somehow use some sort of barter system, is it still feasible under the current UN sanctions?
I think there's potentially some sort of solution you could work that would allow some type of cooperation. I think the challenge is also not just in the sort of the letter of the law, so to speak, on the sanctions themselves, but my sense is that the United States might also not want South Korea to move forward with that at this time, or at a minimum, integrate any sort of steps that might be taken there with regard to Mount Kumgang, but also place that in the broader sequence of step-by-step process within the denuclearization roadmap that the United States is working to develop.
And in North Korea's position, other than South Korea, it may seek out to China to resume that Kumgang tourism project. Doesn't China also face the same limitations as South Korea to pursue economic projects with North Korea?
Well, China does face similar limitations as related to the UN Security Council resolutions, but it doesn't face necessarily the same pressure in terms of the effectiveness of the U.S. ability to impose restrictions on what China does. The relationship between the United States and China has become more adversarial, and as a result, I think that China probably feels that it has more space to do what it wants with North Korea. We've already seen China increasing tourism to North Korea. I was just in China last week, and I met so many researchers who had just been to North Korea or were going to North Korea. And so I would say that in terms of the use of tourism as a way around the sanctions regime, the Chinese are really on the front end of that and could probably find some workarounds to actually move from exchange and money flow to the sphere of investment.
You know, if this were occurring in 2017, for example, I think this is something that the Trump administration would have pushed back quite hard on if it goes down this path. And theoretically, this type of cooperation or this movement of money would subject, in this case, Chinese entities to U.S. secondary sanctions. I'm not sure that is a path that the United States would necessarily go down in this current environment, because it could risk complicating or upsetting the diplomatic apple cart, so to speak.
And Mr. Snyder, Chairman Kim ordering the removal of South Korean facilities, is this somehow related to the new way that he's been talking about?
Well, it remains to be seen. We're still waiting to see what the new way is. But certainly it appears that North Korea is moving toward indigenization, toward a North Korean-led economic development approach. And that means that he's setting aside hopes for external assistance from South Korea or the United States.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Brewer, South Korean media reports that in Stockholm, the United States offered to North Korea a mid to long-term project to help Wonsan Kalma tourism project. And President Trump recently mentioned that there could be a major rebuild in North Korea. So do you think some sort of construction and rebuilding of North Korea is in the Trump administration's economic package?
So President Trump has frequently talked about the role that the United States could play in developing South Korea's economy. I think he's also talked about it specifically with regard to sort of real estate, right? Because that's his approach, that's his mindset. So I think this offer, right, this package, was probably an attempt to take that way of thinking by the president, right, and sort of crystallize it and turn it into an actual diplomatic carrot, if you will, an incentive. It's not clear where that incentive sits within the broader package, within how that would be sequenced with other denuclearization steps. I think that remains to be seen. I'm also not convinced that that type of an offer, which clearly, intended to show that the United States is coming with new ideas, with new incentives, and to push back against this North Korea narrative that Washington's only coming to the table to make demands. I'm not sure that incentive is going to be enough to sort of break this logjam in dialogue. I'm not sure it gets us there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eric is right about that, but it's also true that given President Trump's unconventional approach and his real estate background, the most natural deal for President Trump to want to make would be a kind of nukes for resorts deal, possibly in which there's a Trump-branded international hotel paid for in fissile material.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There has been speculations that there could be Trump Hotel on the border of North Korea and China when the denuclearization is actually achieved. Now, Mr. Brewer, do you think the latest escalation of tensions by North Korea is a prelude to serious negotiations with the United States?
Well, I think it's certainly possible because in the past North Korea has engaged in provocative actions and then taken a turn towards dialogue, sort of to balance those perspectives and as sort of a face-saving measure. But I don't think the current steps towards escalation are necessarily indicative of some sort of serious negotiations, at least along the lines that the United States would hope for in terms of engaging in a sustained and serious working level dialogue towards denuclearization. I just don't think we're there yet. I think, as I said earlier, that Kim continues to believe that he does have the upper hand, that he doesn't yet have to make any sort of serious decision or serious concession on the nuclear program, and that he can continue to wait and slowly dial up this pressure.
Mm-hmm. North Korean negotiator Vice Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee was with Chairman Kim at the Kumgang Mountain. And was this a sign from North Korea to the United States to remove some sanctions?
I think it's a sign that Choi Sun-hee enjoys a closer relationship with Kim Jong-un than maybe her predecessor Kim Dae-kwan had. And with Kim Dae-kwan appearing in the news this week and making a statement about President Trump, I think the really interesting question is, what is the relationship between Choi Sun-hee's role under Kim Jong-un and Kim Dae-kwan's role under Kim Jong-il? And what is the relationship between the two now? I don't think we have good insight into that.
Mm-hmm. And before we go, I want to ask both of you, so in the face of North Korea's increased pressure on the United States to relieve sanctions, what should be U.S. strategy?
Well, I think that the U.S. needs to find a way to recover the ability to pressure North Korea. In a way, I think the problem with the backdrop for the current engagements is that North Korea is leaning forward. But we've had more success in negotiations with North Korea when North Korea is on its back foot, and that's not the case right now.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. has a tough set of challenges right now, right? I mean, we at the one level, you have sort of a negotiating team who's working towards trying to get that sustained process going, trying to develop that roadmap and that step-by-step process. On the other hand, I think you have a president who hasn't totally bought into that and who views and gauges the success of North Korea policy based on his personal relationship with Kim Jong-un, which I'm not sure is the right metric here to gauge progress on actual U.S. objectives towards denuclearization. So you have that challenge, and on top of that, while this is playing out, North Korea is continuing to develop and advance quantitatively and qualitatively its nuclear weapons arsenal and its missile delivery capabilities. And so I fear that while we continue to try and figure out the way forward on denuclearization, I also think we need to be thinking about Plan B and Plan C. To Scott's point, one of those is to figure out how to perhaps gradually, begin to reinforce pressure again in a way that doesn't totally blow up diplomacy. But I also think the United States needs to be thinking about whether and how it's going to have to adjust its deterrence and assurance posture in the region if talks are unsuccessful and Kim Jong-un's program continues to grow in ways that threaten the United States and its allies.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll talk more about the Trump administration's North Korea policy later in the discussion after watching this video.
The truth is that we can't rely on failed strategies to convince Chairman Kim to give up his nuclear weapons.
If somebody else became president with that same mindset that they had, you'd right now be in a big war with North Korea.
In his first statement on North Korea since the breakdown of the Stockholm talks, Secretary Pompeo said, "We can't rely on failed strategies to convince Chairman Kim to give up his nuclear weapons." Now, Mr. Snyder, Secretary Pompeo's comment, this is long-held position in the Trump administration, but how viable is this approach amid the continued stalemate and breakdown of the talks with North Korea?
Well, Secretary Pompeo is obviously making a true statement. No administration wants to rely on prior failed policies in order to achieve objectives. I think the critical question at this point is whether the Trump administration is going to be adding to the dustbin of failed policies on North Korea or whether it's going to find a way to succeed. And I think that what's really in the crosshairs at this point is the question of whether leader-to-leader level dialogue as an innovation under the Trump administration can actually bring the success that we all hope for.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Brewer, other than the leader-to-leader level dialogue that Mr. Snyder just mentioned, how different is Trump administration's approach from the past failed approaches, do you think?
Well, I think that in addition to the leader level dialogue, I think the relationship that Trump has tried to cultivate with Kim and that Kim has tried to cultivate with Trump is truly different, and we can debate whether that's a good or a bad thing. I think it certainly has some costs, and the potential benefits of it haven't quite played out the way we might have hoped, at least yet. I also think something that's different about this administration's approach, and this is in part because of the way the president operates, is they haven't been very good at balancing the diplomatic and the pressure tracks, right? And so in 2016 and 2017, and at least the first part of 2018, it was all pressure, right? And I think the flaw in that strategy was that we weren't very good at signaling to North Korea what they needed to do in order for some type of serious dialogue to take place. And as a result of that, I think we had sort of this sudden, sort of unpredictable pivot towards diplomacy. But now we're in this phase of almost all diplomacy, right? And so I think there's a way to better calibrate those two things. And I think doing that would, to the comment that Scott made earlier, perhaps give us additional leverage in these talks and put North Korea a little bit more on its back feet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And at a time when U.S.-North Korea talks are stalemated, there are pressing domestic and international issues. So would North Korean issue be put on the back burner?
Well, it's definitely got to compete for attention now with other issues. And I think what's really interesting about the most recent cases in Trump administration foreign policy, the Ukraine and the Turkey/Kurdish issue, is that in some ways they present two alternative paths that you could imagine could be appropriated by the North Koreans. One is the possibility of trying to make some kind of deal or quid pro quo, but that actually is not North Korea's strength. They're not very good at that. The other is to try to induce the Trump administration or the president to throw its allies under the bus, as appears to have happened with the Kurdish population. And there, I think that presents a more viable pathway and a possible pathway that the North Koreans may try.
Mm-hmm. And in the new book, Inside Trump's White House, Mr. Jared Kushner is quoted as saying, Kim Jong-un wants to be friends with Trump, but his father told him never to give up the weapons. That's his only security. So what is revealing about this comment?
So I think that's not that surprising, right? And I think that sort of crystallizes North Korea's thinking and Kim Jong-un's thinking on the value of the nuclear weapons and the inherent security risks and uncertainties in ever giving them up, right? We know that North Korea frequently points to the mistakes made by Libya and Iraq, and so I think it certainly crystallizes the value they see in that deterrent. And I think it tells you how far we have to go if we're ever going to reach a place where North Korea feels that it can make that trade-off.
Well, I think that on the Trump side, the interesting thing is that it means that he's got a choice between the relationship and pressing for denuclearization. And for the president himself, I think it would be hard for him to devalue the political value of the relationship in favor of the national interest related to pursuing denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. And North Korea is currently on trajectory of escalating tensions. And President Trump recently mentioned about the possibility of a war with North Korea. So is there a possibility that we could return to the fire and fury days?
I don't really see that in the immediate near term. It really depends on China, I think. China is the entity that sets the ceiling in terms of the risk of renewed escalation. And it's a question of whether North Korea's provocations would challenge China's limit. Because as long as China has North Korea's back, I think the likelihood that we go back to fire and fury is low.
Mm-hmm.
And I would agree with that. I think the risk of going back to that rhetoric, especially from the U.S. side, is low. I think Trump likes the fact that he has a good relationship with Kim Jong-un and that they get along. I think that's something that he's going to want to continue to maintain. And I think we see evidence of that in the way in which he's sort of ignored or sort of pushed under the rug North Korean short-range missile tests and the recent SLBM tests that sort of pushed the bounds of that testing moratorium that they've agreed to. So I think he's going to continue to try to maintain that relationship. And I also think that as domestic distractions potentially heat up with the impeachment inquiry and other developments in the Middle East, Trump could pivot to North Korea because that's where he's comfortable operating, because he has what he views as that good relationship with Kim, and it could make him more likely to potentially seek out a quick win there. And to, again, to Scott's point earlier, that could be potentially dangerous in some ways if North Korea is pursuing a strategy of divide and conquer and seeing what they can get.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll have to leave it here and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of Kim Jong-un on field guidance to vegetable greenhouse farm. He stressed this farming village should set a new example, and greenhouse farms should be built nationwide. Mr. Snyder?
I think what's interesting about this picture is a pretty impressive array of greenhouses in the background, and it really does suggest that North Korea is making progress in terms of using investment in order to build infrastructure that can be beneficial to North Korea's economic aims.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it further emphasizes the theme which we've hit on throughout this conversation, which is this idea of self-reliance and of not needing U.S. assistance and not needing to partner with South Korea. This really, further drives that home, and it sounds like we can expect to see more of that in the coming months.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Snyder, Mr. Brewer, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.